All right, today we have our presentations. We think we have 3 graduating seniors, right? Am I right on that?
Jacob's graduating this semester.
Where is he?
He's supposed to be here.
Supposed to be here,
I
okay.
think Jabez is supposed to go today too.
Yeah, well, we won't even bring that up.
Was
Okay.
anybody really even expecting that?
So we're going to start with Alton, who will be graduating. Yes, round of applause. One other announcement before Alton speaks. The Phi Alpha Theta, excuse me,
God bless you.
thank you. Gesundheit, yes. Danke. The Phi Alpha Theta, I've not heard back from them. They told me when they sent it, it would take 4 to 6 weeks. It's now been 6 weeks. And then in another email I found, I said, well, maybe not till the end of April. So I'm going to write to them probably today and say, look, I've got people who are graduating who signed a petition and we'd like to know what's going on if we could. You know, I don't think pushing them is going to help with these people, but at any rate, I will send them an email this week. Hopefully, we can get it all ironed out. All right, Alton. Propaganda and the Nazis. Is it working?
Yes, sir. I was just waiting.
Yeah, go right
All right.
ahead. Go right ahead.
All right. Like you said, my presentation's on Nazi propaganda in World War II.
See if the, yeah, okay. It's
So before we can kind of dive into the different types of propaganda, the Nazis rose to power. We've been studying this the entire class. I don't have to rehash all the details that we already know. But they basically rose to power through a combination of law, terror, and propaganda. Hitler had a job to kind of win over the German people because of some of his radical ideas and some of the sanctions that were against Germany. And he did this by establishing laws and promoting those laws through a series of means of propaganda, and then also using terror through the SS and SA and things like that.
Weren't they kind of a state sponsor of terror, kind of like Iran is today?
I guess so, I don't know. To deal with some of the problems that Germany was facing, Hitler's propaganda was really geared towards creating scapegoats. A lot of those came through anti-Semitic posts and things like that. One of the most effective things the Nazis did was basically create a brand. It sounds weird to apply brand naming something to something from the 1930s and 1940s, but the Nazis were really ahead of their time in regards to this understanding of the way to promote things and the way to get people to back it. The most effective thing that they did was use symbolism. They created this image of what a German utopia would be like, and the only way you could really have this German utopia was by following Hitler. And so in a way they created this parallel universe, and this parallel universe was something that Germans could truly picture, even though they couldn't really see it at the moment. And by following Hitler was the only way that they were going to achieve this German dream. Uses for Nazi propaganda. Hitler, as we know, he was a romantic. He really just dreamed about the old-timey stories of the heroes during wartime, and he really used this to kind of mold his whole propaganda stream and emulate the Roman Empire. He wanted the German Empire to really just be like Rome. If you look at some of the pictures of Nazi rallies and Nazi events, you can see that the banners flying everywhere, and in a way it almost doesn't look like it applies to 1940s, 1950s. It looks like an old school Roman palace and stuff like that. It was also used to root out threats to the German way of life. Since Hitler had this vision for what he saw the perfect German utopia being, he had to implement policies that would get rid of those scapegoats that he created. And the threats to the German way of life would be other cultures, such as with the anti-Semitic policies, democracy, communism, things like that. And so propaganda would really paint these things as all being evil and all keeping the German people from achieving this dream German utopia. Of course, it promoted the Aryan race in Hitler's youth. I'll talk more about the Hitler Youth and the promotion of the Aryan race a little bit later on. But it basically just brainwashed the citizens of Germany. And the way it did this was by cutting off outside sources and outside media the Germans were able to really just mold the way that the German people thought and basically normalize everyday life in Germany. As far as German people could tell, they were a typical Western society. They didn't have outside information coming in to tell them otherwise. And by normalizing some of the more extreme, radical ideas that the Nazis had, they were able to get the people to more willingly fall in line. Nationalism was one of the big reasons for propaganda. At the beginning of Hitler's rise to power, Germany had lost a lot of territory from World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, and Hitler had a major desire to really bring that territory back under German control. And one of the main things that they did to bring this territory back under, to promote this was they produced a lot of maps. I was really surprised when I looked at some of them, but Hitler wanted his people to see what an ethnically purified Germany would look like, because Hitler wanted to bring the people that were outside of Germany's borders right now back into the country. And in order to do that, he had to violate the treaty. And in order to have the manpower and the strength to violate the treaty, Hitler needed the support from the people. And by promoting this ethnically purified Germany, he really got the people more on his side of saying, oh, that's understandable. I can understand why we want to bring all the German people back into Germany. And that was one of his big schemes for using maps. Probably one of the biggest promotion aspects of Nazi propaganda was centered around education and the Hitler Youth. Hitler's youth were targeted from a very early age, and it all comes back to this idea of Hitler wanting to brainwash the people and make them think the way he thought instead of thinking independently. It really taught kids to focus on external enemies instead of other typical things that you would expect to learn in school, like math and science and things that we would apply today but they considered that to be independent thinking and things that were dangerous. The external enemies were Jews, communists, other Western societies. He had the Hitler Youth so caught up in these enemies that they were so geared to following Hitler, and basically it became a cult worship of Hitler. And there's often cases where kids stopped listening to their parents' rule, and kids would actually turn in their parents for not being as radical and going against some of Hitler's policies. And so it created this pride in the German race that started from a really young age. And if he got the kids thinking that young, then he was able to have more control over them as time went on. And another big aspect of it was this need to live up to physical ideas. Hitler's focus on education focused a lot on the physical attributes of things because, once again, he didn't want people to read books. He didn't want people to study and think for themselves. He wanted people to just kind of trust him on everything. And so to do that, he promoted physical things that wouldn't attribute to independent thinking. Anti-Semitism and racism. There's more to Nazi racism than just anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism is definitely the most prominent one. Posters, films, cartoons, and flyers were seen throughout Germany, and they attacked the Jewish community. You couldn't really walk anywhere down a German street without seeing something advertising for saying something wrong about Jews. The Der Stürmer was a propaganda magazine, and it ran stories about Jews. And a lot of the myths that were made up about Jews ran through this magazine first. And some of these myths were as extreme as Jewish priests and Jewish people kidnapping Christian children because they needed the blood of a Christian to sacrifice and to keep up their way of life. And believe it or not, people actually started buying into this, and it created this extreme hatred for the Jews. And Jews being against Hitler meant that they stood for everything that a good Germany wouldn't want, like democracy, communism, internationalism. And so Hitler said, well, if we want all these positive things, we have to get rid of the Jews because the Jews support everything that we stand against. And one of the most famous films of the time was called The Eternal Jew, and that was directed by Fritz Hippler. And right there you can see the advertising poster for it, and you can see the way that Jews were depicted, often with the large nose, and what I noticed is a lot of the propaganda posters used by the Nazis to describe Jews and things like that, the positive ones, as you'll see on the next page, are very colorful and bright and make you kind of feel like, oh, I'm proud to be German. And if you look at any of depictions of Jews and things, they're very dark and very, in almost a creepy way. So the emotions you see when you see that poster is kind of like, you kind of have a feeling of disgust or kind of feeling of wanting to distance yourself from it almost. Hitler was actually one of the most prominent propaganda figures, which makes sense. A lot of this was his brainchild. He kind of fueled the Nazi propaganda machine, and he was painted as a messiah. As we saw, we all watched Triumph of the Will as one of the video assignments in this class. You could kind of see some of the links between Hitler coming down from the clouds and being, and how the people just radically accepted everything that he said. Triumph of the Will was actually one of the most successful propaganda films of all time, just because of the way it's cheesy to us now, but if you watch it and you look at it, you can just see how it would ignite a sense of passion and pride in one's country. And really, the entire focus of the Nazi propaganda machine was to glorify Hitler. It was to say Hitler is the one leading us, and Hitler is the one making Germany, I don't want to say it this way, but making Germany great again type thing. And I think it's very fair to say that without Hitler and without Hitler's face and this role of him as like a messiah type thing to Germany, the propaganda would not have had the success that it had. And the man responsible for making most of Hitler's propaganda was Joseph Goebbels. He was the Reich Minister of Propaganda from 1933 to 1945. He was about as loyal to Hitler as anybody. He was the equivalent of a yes man, of just saying, yeah, whatever you want, I'm agreeing with you. And his anti-Semitic views he probably rivaled Hitler's in the way that he thought about Jews as well. And he was actually one of the leading advocates for harsher punishments and discrimination practices. And he really pushed for extermination. And with him being in charge of propaganda and pushing those types of things, it's no shock that some of the horrible things happened in Germany that did. He is also, his big thing was radio. He would, when the Nazi Party gained control over the media outlets, they blocked outside information coming in and were able to just feed their views on things. And this one source of information sought to limit independent thinking. And when independent thinking goes away, you kind of start doing what you're told to do. And so to wrap it all up, Nazi propaganda spread throughout all sectors of German society and was not just limited to posters and flyers. The control the government had over radio and film outlets allowed the Nazis to brainwash the German people. Since the Germans were brainwashed, the actions of Hitler began to be normalized. Like it or not, the Germans were well ahead of their time in creating one of the most effective propaganda machines of all time. Without their mastery of propaganda, Hitler's policies would have been more difficult to get away with. And that's it.
Okay, very good. Any comments or questions? Okay, hearing none.
When did Hitler really start getting serious?
Serious? Well, it was 1933 is when like the propaganda really started coming out, and then I don't have like an exact date for you, but it was definitely late 1930s that it kind of reached its height. And
Before the war started?
yeah, it was before the war, because a lot of towards the end of the war, you see that a lot of the soldiers and stuff in Germany are the young kids and things like that, and a lot of those were pulled directly out of the Hitler Youth programs. So.
Hitler Youth was actually just the Boy Scouts that they turned into the Hitler Youth, right?
Yeah.
All right, we're going to move on. Next, we have Chuck's son is going to give us a presentation. You know, Chuck Norris. This is Chad Norris. Yeah. Don't want you to confuse the two, but they both have the same initials and the same last name. So,
Oh, I get it.
wow. Okay. Yeah, you know, sometimes they say if you have to explain the joke, it's not worth doing. But in this case, it actually got a laugh. So.
Don't want to get super cute.
Let's go right ahead. Inside his world.
Chad Norris's world.
Yeah.
Chad, tell us about your world. Is this like Boy Meets World? Hitler Meets World.
This This is Hitler's world. Yeah, not my world.
Fight Nazis?
Yeah. Okay, my presentation. In what ways did Hitler exploit anti-Semitism to achieve his final solution? He did it by taking biblical passages out of context. He did it by scapegoating the Jewish people. He did it by domination in a ethnic and a blood type of state. He did it by propagation, by spreading lies and by propagating lies. He did it by exclusion through the Volksgemeinschaft, which I talked about earlier this year. He did it by purification with blood tests. He did it by sterilization. He did it by extermination, finally. Like I said, he took key biblical passages out of context in his quest for, the final solution. Some quotes are, "Hence today I believe that I'm acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. By defending myself against the Jew, I'm fighting for the work of the Lord." And one really bad example of him taking it out of context is the bottom when he says, basically he uses that example of Jesus casting the Jewish people out of the temple, and he twisted it to a way in which he made it seem like they were like an enemy of the human race. But if you actually read the biblical passage, you realize that it's because they were disrespectful. That's the reason why they were kicked out. But he used it in a way where it was like they were an enemy of the human race, which is, he used it in that way. He took it out of context. This is an example of the scapegoating. One really good example I use is, if you know what this is a depiction of the November criminals when they stole the war from Germany in 1918. Basically what you see is the soldiers in the trench, and you see the people coming up behind them, the popular stab in the back myth, where they're getting stabbed in the back by their own people, basically. Those are basically the German monarchy was overthrown, and they were replaced with political leaders at that time, and incidentally, many of them included Jews and Marxists. So there was kind of a way for Hitler to, kill two birds with one stone, in a sense. By getting rid of his political opposition, he was also getting rid of the Jews at the same time, since they were both kind of intertwined. Domination, we already, like I said, he used it to kill two birds with one stone, in a sense, and by the degradation of groups such as the Bolsheviks, the Communists, and the Social Democrats, this would put the Nazi Party in position of great power. And as the picture that I used is, I actually used it earlier. It was, Bolsheviks and Communists being incorporated into the Nazi camp with either they would have a red triangle on their jacket for communists, and other color-coded triangles for other, parties and stuff. It was a way for them to dominate in a sense where they ruled the entire society. Propagation. There's a picture at the bottom, as you said about Joseph Goebbels. He was a great master of propaganda and stuff, and he said, if you tell a big enough lie and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. And you see that over and over again throughout society. The more that it's pushed out into the forefront, the more it's more widely accepted, the more it becomes widely believed. And there's a really messed up quote at the top that Hitler used. He said, basically he used it to, if you read it, he kind of paints the Jew in a description of being satanic in a way. Like he's using it to paint the example that he's basically preying on German girls, and the goal is to adulterate the blood and remove her from the bosom of her own people. And that's basically, it goes along with his previous ideas about race and stuff, about how they're intermarrying and how that's not, good and stuff, and how basically German girls are being stolen by Jews, and it's just one whole big mess. But exclusion, I talked a little bit about the Volksgemeinschaft earlier this year. It's a way for, as Hitler said, none but members of the nation may become members of the state, and only people of German blood may be members of the nation. And that was a way for him to exclude the Jews from the nation. And by doing that, Hitler would accomplish one of his main goals, which was a pure blood German society. And that was another way, it was another step toward, in many ways, it was kind of step one in a sense of the final solution, because if you can exclude them from society, you can paint kind of an anti, you know what I'm trying to say, but it was kind of one of the first steps toward extermination. So purification, I guess this could be step one, but either way, I found some good examples that they used. If you were 1/8 Jewish, you would belong to the Reich and be approved for citizenship. And if you were 1/4 Jewish, you'd partly belong to the Reich, but you'd still be approved for citizenship. And basically, anything below 1/2 Jewish, you did not belong to the Volksgemeinschaft, and you would not be approved for citizenship. So anything below 1/2 Jewish, you were basically, for lack of a better word, screwed, I guess. But this is a poster basically painting what I just talked about, like 1/8 Jewish, 1/4 Jewish, 1/2 Jewish, going down, the list and stuff, and like if you were going to be approved or not, basically based off that. So sterilization would be step 2, I'd say, because Hitler would introduce hereditary health courts and make those basically to stop people that he didn't want reproducing from reproducing. And you can see that the picture at the bottom, it was on a pretty wide scale. It was 400,000 Germans to be sterilized at one point by 1,700 hereditary health courts. So it was pretty widespread. There was a lot of people caught up in this thing. And also, it kind of espoused Darwinism, as Hitler was attempting to implement survival of the fittest policies. He didn't think that people that were weak and, were not of a good blood type should be reproducing, and this was a way for him to implement that. Extermination end goal, obviously. I saw an interesting statistic. There was about a 3% chance of surviving in a Nazi concentration camp once it was full blown. So basically, it shows how hopeless the situation was. They were designed for extermination. Like, I would say that when you were admitted to a concentration camp, the goal was for you not to leave. So the end goal was definitely extermination. And another quote by Joseph Goebbels, you can read it for yourself if you want. It's pretty long, but basically it talks about the Führer, who was Hitler. He's determined to make a clean sweep of the Jewish people, and if they brought about another world war, they would experience their annihilation. And this was no empty talk. And he keeps talking about the annihilation of the Jews must be the necessary consequence, and we're not having sympathy with the Jews. And it's an example of propaganda, like you earlier stated. It was just a way to spread the sentiment that these people were not worthy of life and that type of thing, and it eventually led to that. So I think that's one of the more striking pictures of the Holocaust. All the glasses and hair. It's really. It's sick what they did, but yeah, it's my presentation.
Question?
With the sterilization, how did they force people to go in to be sterilized?
It was they were secret decisions made by the hereditary health courts, and basically you had no choice in the decision. It was forced for the most part.
So you had to go into the hospital.
Yes, if it was a forced sterilization, you'd be forced to get the sterilization. So
Yeah, you'd have to go to a hospital or doctor. You would receive orders, basically, or papers that's requiring you to go. If you didn't go, then you would be arrested and probably sterilized, or maybe sent off to a camp, put into prison, that sort of thing. All right, let's see. Windows. This one's yours, right? Jacob, is this one yours? Oh, you can't see it.
yeah, I will see.
Okay, why don't you come on up and
I hope it
we'll do yours. I can hand your stuff out for you. Okay. Do you need one?
Something's wrong here.
Okay. We'll let people share. You remember her?
Sharing is caring.
She was the singer.
Thank you so much.
I think there's two there.
You're going to stake that. You're going to stake one.
I like this
Jacob.
box, Jacob.
Jacob.
Yeah, but you should still put a staple on it because.
Here.
That was mine.
All right, go right ahead. Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
So Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor in Nazi Germany. He grew up in a middle-class family, and then he got involved in theology and really had a brilliant mind. Everything is written down on paper, so it's just me pictures.
Why don't you stand a little closer to the
Podium.
computer so we can record you?
What
Oh.
denomination-
Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Yeah, you're being recorded.
Okay.
What denomination is he from?
Denomination, he grew up Lutheran church. So he was a Protestant pastor. Now the dilemma in Germany was that Dietrich wanted the church to. He didn't like what Hitler was doing, but some of the churches were going along with what Hitler wanted. They were going along with the nationalist belief. So Hitler comes in and he has an unlawful church repositioning. So all the pastors that he doesn't want there, that don't go along with him, get voted out. And they bring in new ones. Now that includes any pastors that had Jewish descent. So even if they weren't Jewish and they had Jewish roots, they were removed from the church. So Bonhoeffer wanted to fight this. My entire research paper, though, was about Bonhoeffer's he traveled to America. And in America, he encountered vastly different theology than what was going on in Germany. German theology was very intellectual at the time. In American theology, the difference was it was very, I guess, practical, you could say. Very, very different roots than what Germany had gone through. And he talks about how America didn't really have a Reformation. It was Germany that had the Reformation. And you could see the difference there. So his encounter in America really shaped the way that he started to combat Nazism when he came back. And so I looked at that in my paper. And what I discovered is that Bonhoeffer started off as a very strong intellectual person. And his theology was centered around just studying the Word of God, but not actually applying it per se. But Americans were more into like living it, not just talking about it in the intellectual realms in the seminaries, but actually like applying it. And he kind of found America could be boring as far as theology was concerned because he was so high-minded. But what happened was he started experiencing the church in Harlem because he traveled. He went to Union Theological Seminary in New York, and some of his good friends there influenced him really heavily on this dilemma of how the church should react to violence. How should the church respond to the stuff that was going to happen in Germany? And so he was around. There was an instance where he was with one of his black friends from the seminary. His last name was Fisher, and they went to a restaurant. And when they went to the restaurant, the people wouldn't serve Fisher and his friends because they were black. And Bonhoeffer erupted in like this massive outrage of how could you be racist like this? And that kind of began Bonhoeffer's journey to being more, and he began to be more interacting in the discrimination, which would turn into racism in Germany against the Jews, and his experience with the racism in America helped him to see how the blacks interacted with that racism. So that started a shift from intellectual to actually living out the faith. And so Bonhoeffer wrote a book called The Cost for Discipleship. And in that book he talks about how the Christians, we need to live out our faith in a very practical way. And so he kind of outlines that the cost we have is to not just live like the world and kind of give in, but be different. So, we go on another picture. Bonhoeffer loved people. Like, he was a pastor at heart. He loved interacting with children. He loved speaking with congregations. He preached in America when he was here. And he was really touched by the Harlem church and how they had really passionate worship. And it was a lot more emotional than what he was used to. A lot more heart in it than just intellectual Lutheran church that he was used to. So that was really cool. This is his study. You can see it's pretty, to me it kind of has like a German feel to it. It's very straightforward and not a whole lot around to distract. He was incredibly intelligent. If you turn to the back page of the paper, I have a few quotes from him. Bonhoeffer, when he got back to America in 1931, that was about the time when the Nazi Party was starting to rise in the, is it pronounced Reichstag? Right?
Reichstag.
Yeah, in politics. I don't know German. So Hitler started to discover, like, oh wow, this is starting to get really bad. They started raising Nazi flags above some churches. Hitler, as I mentioned before, invaded the church with church leaders that agreed with him. So all the German Christians started getting really bad against the Jews, really racist against the Jews. So that's when he wrote The Cost of Discipleship. Somewhere.
Didn't they even, I thought they declared Hitler as like the head of the German church officially instead of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, they did. There was a big shift. It got really bad. And so Bonhoeffer was a key member of what's called the Confessing Church, members of pastors that went against Nazism. They spoke against it. Bonhoeffer would speak on the radio. I think I have a quote on there from something he said on the radio. Yeah, the broadcast. I don't know what it says. I kind of need one. Yeah, so he openly was speaking against it. After a while, Bonhoeffer got in this really difficult dilemma where people were getting killed, they're getting hauled off to concentration camps, the churches are starting to fall apart, and he didn't really know what to do. He got involved with a conspiracy spying on the government in an attempt to assassinate Hitler. It's debated how much influence he had in that movement, but it got to a point where the seminary in Berlin that he taught at got closed down, was declared illegal because it was speaking against the state, and then he started an illegal seminary, an illegal church. It got to the point where he was considered an enemy of the state, and he got arrested, and he was sent to prison for a couple of years. In that prison, he wrote a really good theological work, which was just letters, but it's been compiled into Letters and Papers from Prison, and there's a quote on there from that too as well, if you want to read that. Just amazing theology. But at the heart of all this was Bonhoeffer's problem with pacifism He was a pacifist, but he was afraid that things in Germany were getting so bad that the Christian church, would be eliminated in Germany. That there wouldn't even be a future for the church if Hitler won. So he got involved with the assassination attempt. After Bonhoeffer was in prison, he was convicted of crimes against Hitler, and he was sentenced to death on April 9th, 1945. Pretty much, it was really close to the time American troops almost got to where he was, but 2 months before they got there, he was executed at dawn on April 9th, 1945. Part of the problem with looking at Bonhoeffer is that because his life was cut short, a lot of the conclusions that we can make about his theology are kind of subjective because he didn't get to finish his thoughts. So, in my paper, I talk about that. My conclusion, though, is that America had a very strong influence on the way Bonhoeffer shifted from his intellectual assault on Nazism to his actual practical under-the-cover work, doing spy work, and his motivation to do illegal church work against the state. And that was brought on by his influence with his friends in Harlem, and how the black church interacted with racism in America. Here's a few more pictures. And
All right.
there's a monument to Bonhoeffer at St. Petersburg Church. So he's seen as a hero of the faith, which very well should be, because he gave his life.
All right, any questions? Very good. Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
I have a question.
Got one question.
How exactly was he executed? Was he like trial or?
Hung him. Yeah. He was hanged by the neck until dead. All right, Sarah.
See that guy in Valkyrie? Or is that somebody else? You ever seen that movie Valkyrie?
That's all right.
See that guy, or is that somebody else?
Now we're going to hear about three ladies: Vera, Violette, and Virginia.
So these three,
Let's give our attention to Sarah, please.
so these three girls gave Hitler a lot of headaches. Gave the Nazis a lot of headaches. Vera was a Romanian Jew. Actually, very few people knew about that until after the war. Violet was French and English, and Virginia was American, though she did work for the British intelligence for a time. They were spies. Vera was kind of the mastermind, and then she oversaw Violet and Virginia, particularly Violet. They were actually friends. And so these three ladies gave Hitler quite a few headaches, operating out of France. Vera was the boss. That's in quotations because the guy who wrote James Bond actually knew her, worked with her, actually considered her the boss. And literally, though, she did run the French section of the SOE, the Strategic Operations Executive. She was actually the assistant to the head, the director, but by all accounts that I've uncovered, he was really rather inept. Probably shouldn't have been in that position. So as his assistant, she kind of ran operations. She was well educated. Her father was a successful businessman and paid for her to receive the best instruction in practical things like horsemanship, marksmanship, dance. These are things that she would later on use in networking, in building networks before emigrating to Britain. And then she went off to finishing schools in France and Switzerland, went to secretarial school, and then later received practical experience working for her father in management in her father's office. She built up, before working for intelligence, she did build up her own network. She was well known in Nazi circles as well as anti-Nazi circles. So she had influence. She knew how to network. She knew how to get information, which all of this is very valuable for her career. Violet was the daughter of a British World War I soldier and a French woman. They actually met during the First World War. So she was a British citizen. Her parents moved to Britain, but her mother had extensive family in France still, so she actually spent much of her childhood in France, receiving probably a better education than she would have in Britain. As a result of living abroad, she was fluent in French, Dutch, and Flemish. Again, her skills, her familiarity with France that came from her childhood growing up there would be invaluable later on when she would work undercover, face to face with Nazis, fooling them into thinking that she was 100% French and hated the Allies. Actually, she received average marks in SOE training when she was recruited. Her supervisors were surprised at that. They would see her marks, and then they would see, actually, this is after she's already an operative. They would see her marks, and then they would see her results, and they wouldn't quite understand that. Virginia was a debutante. She was born to a wealthy family, but because her family was wealthy, she had so many opportunities to improve her education. She studied at the Sorbonne, at Barnard and Radcliffe, Consular Academy. After all that time spent abroad studying at various universities, she actually went back to Washington, studied foreign languages some more at George Washington University. She wanted to be a diplomat. So she got a job as a clerk, and I believe she's in Turkey. Her last station was in Turkey. She kind of served in many offices around Europe, but her last station was in Turkey. She was in a hunting accident. She shot her foot. It got infected. A surgeon had to come in and operate, cut it off. So she had a wooden leg, which is just the coolest thing. She had a wooden leg, but at the time, invalids were not permitted to work in foreign service. So that kind of put that career path at an abrupt halt. So she went back to traveling abroad, and she was actually in Paris when the Germans invaded France. At which time she joined the French ambulance service, volunteering. I believe she was a lieutenant. I'd have to confirm that. But after Germany actually overtook France, she escaped to Britain, joined the SOE, and then after America, well, over a year actually after America entered the war, she joined the OSS. They were all very influential in the success of D-Day. You think of D-Day, you think of the beach, you think of the invasion, but Vera had actually been prepping for a couple years for this operation. She had fooled the German intelligence into thinking the actual site of invasion would be somewhere else, and she also established networks in France that would cut supply routes and communication routes into Normandy. If the Germans had been able to retreat faster, then D-Day might not have succeeded. If they had been able to get aid and supplies faster, then D-Day might not have succeeded. Violet was one of those spies who infiltrated. She had been in in France, establishing networks, but then she went back to Britain and then came back. Actually, she flew over the English Channel as the Allied forces were sailing to Normandy, which is just so cool. She was betrayed and captured, and I'm probably not going to get to all of that, but she was executed in Ravensbrück, Ravensbrück concentration camp. She was tortured, interrogated, raped, eventually murdered. Virginia infiltrated France before D-Day, and she blew up 4 bridges, various communication lines, train tracks, and supply routes, but she also trained more French operatives, French resistance fighters to assist her with that. And then concentration camps, again, Violet's mission was, she was a courier. She coordinated, communicated between various networks in France, and then she was ambushed, taken to all these places, and then finally executed not long before the Allies liberated Ravensbrück. The order was given not when Allies made it clear that they were going to be taking Ravensbrück in the near future. The Germans there gave the order that everybody assumed to be Allied intelligence was to be executed before Ravensbrück was liberated. Ravensbrück was more of a prison in that everyone it was punishment. It was more of a punishment. If you were a criminal, you would go there. Jews, I believe, were actually in the minority at this particular camp, and it was primarily women held there. So she was executed.
All right, thank you. That was very good. All right, we'll see you on Friday.
How long does my presentation have?
About 6 minutes.
Okay, and I need a PowerPoint for it, right?
Yes.
Okay.